Good evening and welcome to the Graduate Center. My name is Chase Robinson. I'm president of the Graduate Center. Happen to be a historian, but I'm here in a entirely ceremonial capacity. Tonight we are honored to host a discussion centered on the fascinating new book, After Appomattox, Military Occupation and the Ends of War, featuring its author, Gregory Downes, and renowned Civil War historian, David Blight. A word or two about the Graduate Center. Some of you will know that the Graduate Center is a graduate school of arts and sciences. It's also a center for applied and theoretical research, and this is especially appropriate given what we are doing tonight, it is a platform for performance, for conversation, and for public debate. As a community of students and scholars committed to the idea that learning is a public good, we regularly offer public programs featuring eminent thinkers, writers, artists, and cultural leaders. Many of you are already familiar with Greg Downes' historical insights. His op-ed in the April 11th Sunday New York Times has been widely read and discussed. Reflecting on Lee's surrender to Grant 150 years ago, Downes argues that the war was not over in 1865, but rather it entered a period of military occupation and prolonged conflict. The myth of Appomattox, he says, fosters a national amnesia about what wars are and how they end, a lacuna that has undermined American post-war efforts ever since. In that spirit, tonight's discussion looks not only at the Civil War, but what lessons may also be applied to today's ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We were reflecting before we came out on the big sign behind George Bush on the carrier, mission accomplished, perhaps premature. Gregory Downes is associate professor at the Graduate Center and City College. Besides After Appomattox, he's the author of Declarations of Dependence, The Long Reconstruction and Popular Politics in the South, and the story collection Spit Baths, winner of the Flannery O'Connor Award. David Blight is a Bancroft and Douglas Award-winning historian from Yale University, where he directs the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. His many books include American Oracle, The Civil War and the Civil Rights Era, and A Slave No More, Two Men Who Escaped to Freedom. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you, Greg, for inviting me here to talk about your book. In full disclosure, I read Greg's manuscript of this book about a year ago in manuscript and raved about it to the book's editor, Joyce Seltzer. I don't know if Joyce is here tonight. There were a few criticisms, but it was one of those manuscripts you read where you realize, whoa, there's something new here. We had an occupation after all. Can't hurry past that in my lecture course anymore. I got to talk about that occupation. And there's much, much more there. But Greg, I want to get you to talk at first about two big things. First, this myth of Appomattox. And as I just mentioned to Greg earlier, I want to hear you on this again, and I'm sure the audience would, because 2 weeks ago I was at Appomattox for the 150th anniversary weekend. And I can tell you the myth of Appomattox was alive and well on steroids, with thousands of reenactors and thousands of people, tourists, historical tourists. They estimated 20,000 people came to the park in the 4 days from April 9 to April 12. And it's one of those myths which we need to characterize, but you can't kill it, even if you wanted to. Just a quick observation. My job on the 12th, which is the day they commemorated the stacking of the arms, and by the way, they did it 3 times because of the level of the tourist. It was like a Broadway show being done 3 times, 3 matinees in one day, 11, 1, and 3 p.m., and you could watch any one of them or all three of them. And these reenactors performed it. This is hundreds of them, with great solemnity and silence all three times. And then I had to go speak on some stage to a diehard few hundred who bothered to go hear a lecture. But the sheer spectacle, the tableau of those reenactors, recreating that silence, that solemnity, that honor for honor idea, that gentleman's agreement, that respect among soldiers, was irresistible. Even to me, when I watched the stacking of those arms, I was practically weeping myself, and I kept thinking, God. And then you'd hear a reenactor's cell phone go off, and you'd realize we're not in 1865. But what is this myth of Appomattox? What is its power, and why are we still talking about it?
Wow, those are very important questions. I mean, I think the myth of Appomattox starts with the idea, with the problem, which is that Americans, like any country, they want to think of themselves as a unified people, divided at times, right? But a unified people. I grew up in Kentucky, right? United we stand, divided we fall is the state motto. It's never quite clear to me which side they think things turned out, but at least that's the aspiration. And so the Civil War sits as this weirdly un-American and yet the ultimate American event, right? This war between Americans over the future of America. And that creates, I think, a cognitive dissonance on a really basic level, not just for historians, but for everybody who tries to think about what an American identity means. And so there's a lot invested in the idea that there has to be some neat closing point, a conclusion that lets us say, and then we put it behind us. Whatever had divided before, whatever had been the things that tore the country apart in such bloody ways, that it ended. And that's why I think that when we think about Appomattox, we think about the portrayals of the room, of Wilmer McLean's house, right? This sort of amazing figure who had fled from Bull Run because of the battles there and moves to Appomattox, and his house becomes the site of the surrender ceremony. And of these gentlemen, you're right, the two gentlemen who reach a so-called gentleman's agreement. As you know, Liz Varon, a tremendous historian at University of Virginia, has written a lot about deconstructing how we misunderstand even the actual engagement in the moment of Appomattox. But it's very powerful. And that the idea that if...
It wasn't so brotherly and friendly.
Not so brotherly and friendly.
Straight ahead business.
That's right. But it's very meaningful to us to think that then at that moment, the problems of the war get solved, and we get to turn to this messy, confusing, sometimes inspiring, sometimes dispiriting thing called Reconstruction. But as you know, none of that's true. That in the lead up to the event, Robert E. Lee had written to Grant and asked, could we meet to end the war? Could we meet to determine peace? And Grant turns to one of his generals and says, Lee means to fight. Meaning that if the stakes of their meeting was about peace, then they were actually going to keep fighting. And his other generals, his staff, are outraged at the notion that Lee thinks that they can do anything to deal with peace, that that's the job of the president and Congress. Some of them say the Senate, and confusing it with the treaty power. And so Grant writes to say, about peace, I can wish for it like you can, but I can do nothing to end the war. But what I can do is take a surrender. And
it's a military exchange.
That's right.
It's not a political treaty.
That's exactly right.
We want it.
We want it to be a treaty, right? To ring the bell, the kiss in Times Square for World War II, Armistice Day. We want it to be the moment everything comes together and is resolved.
So Reconstruction, for the sake of this brilliant New York audience who learned something about Reconstruction in school, maybe, in the biggest sense, what is Reconstruction? What were its stakes? And further, just because you've written so well about this now from different angles, why that decade? Reconstruction didn't necessarily end in 1877 as we always date it, but it's just one decade of our history. I mean, maybe there are a few other decades that have had this kind of topsy-turvy, almost brutal historiography turning itself on its head, possibly the decade of the Revolution and Constitution, maybe the 1930s with the Depression, maybe the 60s, although that's too recent. why reconstruct? Why is that such a devilish period for us to face? And most people still don't really even want to.
Well, one thing I learned early on from one of my students at City College was, an immigrant, as many of our students are. And at the end of the first class, he came up to me and said, I can never get it straight in my head. I know you guys have these two big events, but I can't remember which one do you call the Civil War and which one do you call the Revolution? And at one level,
You said both.
Exactly. Well, what I said is that, I'll tell you what they call it, but it's actually totally wrong, right? We have a I'm going to offend the revolutionary historians, but we have a civil war over sovereignty within England. And then we have a revolution that really makes an entirely new country. And the fact that we've misnamed them is interesting, but I don't think that we have to be bound by it. So in that sense, I do think that like any revolutionary period, it's a period where incredible things sit on the table, right? A whole new world in the making. And also the counter-revolution against it, the incredible pushback and the disappointments that that brings, that it is the closest, it's not a French Revolution, but it's the closest we have to that feeling of everything is possible, and we have to live with the consequences of what did and did not eventually come out of it.
It's a remaking of the United States.
That's right. When you think about, even on a real basic level, the Constitution, right? The 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, no slavery, equal process, due process, equal protection under the law, and that the right to vote not be denied based on race or previous servitude. That this is what makes the Constitution work in the way that we think it works, that we have rights in relation to the states, which would have astounded people early in the 19th century.
And since you mentioned that, I want to announce here that a year from now is the 150th anniversary of the 14th Amendment. And there ought to be conferences and events commemorating the 14th Amendment 1,000 times over, all over the country. There won't be, probably, except among academics and law schools and so on. But you could argue that Section 1 of the 14th Amendment is about the most important thing in the Constitution, and only a tiny number of Americans could even tell you what's there.
Right.
If you went out and asked people on the street, what's Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, you'll get pretty depressed.
And in ways that we'll get to and spell out in a little bit, that these amendments are really products of occupation and to a certain degree of a recourse, or at least a potential recourse, to martial law. Just as the Constitution's own origins can be messier than we would like to think, not springing full form from the head of the people. That this remaking, making the Constitution that we use, was something that required extending war powers, and the freedom that we have is going to come from our use of force.
Now explain that, because this is crucial to your argument, that the war power, there's a surrender of armies, 4 surrenders actually, Appomattox is only one of them. There's a surrender of armies in April and May of 1865. But the legal war power, a president authorized by Congress, is sustained in some places at least until 1871, right? What do you mean by that? Because that's your argument, that the war doesn't end.
That's right.
Because the power of control over the defeated enemy does not end.
That's
what
right.
do you mean by that? What is that war power, and who's using it?
So it's a problem of language, but it has real consequences for what they could do and how we can understand it. We know that when it emerged for me as I started to read, the arguments at the top, because looking at the fights on the ground, you can find lots of people, as you know, who say we live in the thick of war in the 1870s.
Yeah.
But they mean that as we're living in chaos and violence, and that's certainly an important thing to capture, but not all violence is war, and I was skeptical of that notion. I don't think that we live in the Civil War today. We might live in the consequences of it, but not in the Civil War today. But that when I look back, you can see that at key moments, the people who are the real players are very careful not to say, with some occasional exceptions, that the war is over. They know that with the end of battlefield fighting, what we think of as war, armies on the field of battle in uniform, was coming to an end. But Grant refuses to make peace with Lee. At the next major surrender in North Carolina, when Sherman does reach an agreement of peace, which he says will go from the Rio Grande to the Potomac, and into the war, that the cabinet, even Andrew Johnson, the deserved villain of Reconstruction, rejects that immediately. That when people write in, Winchester, Virginia, leading general, quite a smart, conservative, but quite a smart general, writes in after Appomattox and says, now it's time for me to pull my troops out of town, right? We're in peace, and the people can govern themselves. Grant's chief of staff writes back and says that it's such a foolish question he won't even bother Grant with it. That anybody who has thought knows that they're not in peace and that they're not retreating from town. In Alexandria, Virginia, just across the river from Washington, D.C., freed people write, eventually their letter gets to President Johnson, and they say, whatever you do, don't end the war. Because if you end the war, and this speaks to why it matters.
That's the way they talk about it.
Yeah.
Don't end the war.
That we need, now their exact letters that we need military, don't end our military oversight is the language that those particular freed people use. But within the Army and in Congress, it's specifically said in that way. And why not? Well, they say if you withdraw the military oversight, then we're stuck under the laws of Virginia. And with no offense to the good people of Alexandria, Virginia today, they were very clear what that meant in 1865. It meant that the people who had run slavery would be in charge of their lives, and that they would have no recourse, and that they knew what their rights they were entitled to, but they also knew they needed a force that could step in between them, and they didn't really see at that point another force other than putting the military in the way.
Which is exactly politically how Robert E. Lee, right, and many, many other Confederates interpreted Appomattox or wanted to interpret it. They wanted to interpret the surrender terms, the leniency of these surrender terms. Just go home, keep your sidearms, keep your mule or your horse, and go put in a crop. Lee and his staff wanted to interpret that as go home, run your own lives, run your own legislature, run your own politics, and do whatever you will do with race relations. That's not what Grant meant.
Well, that's right.
That's not what Lincoln meant.
The Union as it was, the Constitution as it is, or sometimes reversed. But that sense that they wanted to go back to the status quo ante. But over and over, different people, high in Washington, judges, Supreme Court justices, Attorney General, senators, whether they're all high or not, we'll see. We could debate. But also people on the ground, say slaves running to U.S. outposts, say that this would be the worst outcome of all. Not worse than the Confederacy defeating the United States, but that in 1865 that was unacceptable. And why? It's because of what peacetime means in the U.S. In peacetime, the Army can't come in and depose the mayor of New York City or overrule a judge's order. And they crucially can't do things that continue to rise in moments of wars in the United States, like the president suspends habeas corpus and the Army gets freer reign to act because of that. They can't run military commissions. And these powers, many of which are very disturbing because they violate our sense of how things should go, our kind of procedural liberalism, were the only powers that many people in the United States believed were going to be sufficient to attack slavery in 1865.
And the federal government has created, even before the war ends, something called the Freedmen's Bureau, this unprecedented agency put in place, at least for a while. Never had enough budget, but it's put in place to do all kinds of things, not least of which was to negotiate labor contracts. So if you don't have some kind of occupation, this unprecedented agency of welfare, and that word even gets used, the Freedmen's Bureau in the South, would not be able to function without something to protect it or something to enforce what they're trying to do, right? So if you're going to vote through a Freedmen's Bureau, you almost have to still believe it's wartime.
That's right.
Isn't that what you're really arguing?
That's right. And you can see this on two levels. Even before you get to that point, one question is, had slavery ended? And on this, as the U.S. Army moves through the countryside in 1865, they write back very unambiguously, slavery still lives. Scholars estimate maybe 2.8 million of the nation's 4 million former slaves, were still held in bondage at the end of the war. And it was not at all guaranteed that they would be freed. Many Southerners believed they would defeat the 13th Amendment, and they'd go to court and get at least compensation for the slaves who had gotten away, if not a restoration of them. Lincoln, of course, was adamant that they would never be restored, but he was genuinely concerned that if they didn't get the 13th Amendment through,
There's nothing
slavery would
guaranteed
survive.
about just what will replace slavery until somebody does it.
That's right. So you get someone like Lewis Hughes, lives in Pontotoc, Mississippi, right next to Tupelo, famous or infamous later for another of its native sons. But he had run away 4 times during the war, and each time been captured and brought back. And he writes that months after Appomattox, they're still being held as slaves. And they know they should be free. They know the U.S. has won, But without any soldiers around, they can't do anything about it. The master, they're still running slave patrols. He runs to Memphis. The Memphis says, you're free. He says, let me write it down on a piece of paper. And Hughes says, that paper's not going to do me any good. And he says, I need people, I need bodies, I need bayonets. And they say, well, we can't send them. And so he comes back, and as he goes through Mississippi, he stops in Senatobia, and another former slave tells him, all the soldiers are camped out here. Don't go to the captain. He's been drinking with the local planters. But go to the guys at the end. He goes into their tents, tells them, pays them with $5 that he somehow gets in the late spring, early summer of 1865. They ride with him to Pontotoc. When they get there, the master says, I don't care what you say, I'm not freeing them. And they say, perfect, because we've got 70 guys on horses coming right behind, and they're really going to want all your grain. And then the master says, okay, get them out of here, get them out of here. But that's a lie. That even the soldiers recognize, as they say over and over what they're told by the slaves, that you can issue proclamations, and they can't end slavery. Not because the proclamations aren't right, but because if you wish to end slavery, it'll take the bayonet to do it.
What you're describing, and I want to come back to this before we end, is just the unprecedented, profound, almost impossible challenges of the first few years of Reconstruction. This occupation faced something Americans, or for that matter, maybe no country ever had. Emancipation of 4 million people practically overnight in historical time into something else. Determined by what, by whom, and enforced by whom. Before we move on, give the audience some sense of the numbers here. That is, the numbers of occupation. The size of the United States Army at the end of the war, how there's a lot of demobilization, but not as fast and as vast as we might have thought over that first 2, 3, 4, and even 5 years of Reconstruction. Give a sense of the numbers. And then they'll all buy the book and they can see your graphs.
There'll be a quiz on the numbers at the
Good
end.
graphs.
Yeah, if there's anything that sells books, it's graphs.
Good graphs. Even I can read them.
So as you know, the U.S. Army at the time of surrender is just slightly more than 1 million people, the vast majority of whom are volunteers. Interestingly, the vast majority of them have signed up for a number of years. For most of them, it's 3, but for others, it's 1 or 2, or the duration of the war. And so this problem of when the war ends manifests immediately at Appomattox, where many of them say, I'm out, right? The war is over. And the Army emphatically says, the war ends when we say so, and we say so when the President and Congress agree. They didn't realize how hard that was going to be.
Further south.
That's right, further south into the west. And enormous numbers of desertions during that period, which the Army later treats as distinct from people who deserted before Appomattox. So this difference matters. And many of them then march on these 2 days in late May through Washington, D.C., an enormous, in some ways almost as famous a day in 1865 as Appomattox for them, though not for us, called the Grand Review, where they march massive armies through Washington, D.C., parades and flowers. They stop at the receiving stand, the new president, Andrew Johnson.
That's in like the last week of May.
Exactly. And so they march through Washington, D.C., and many of them march home. And for a lot of scholars who are sympathetic to Reconstruction, there's often a sense that then the Army moves off stage and we turn to things like the Freedmen's Bureau. But in fact, what happened was that of the perhaps 200,000 or so who march off in those days, that's a small chunk of 1 million people. And that well more than 100,000 remain on duty in the South through the rest of the year, which is an occupying force in the 19th century, and perhaps even in the 21st century, is a relatively large one. Sufficient to govern a place the size of Western Europe? No, of 750,000 square miles, but quite large. And then the Army that stays on will decline over the course of 65 and 66, but still tens of thousands of people. In these sites, what's most interesting about it is how widespread their occupation is.
These are Army posts.
These are Army posts.
Creating whole new places.
That's right. Sometimes in town squares and tents, sometimes by seizing hotels, sometimes at the edge of town or right across. But I estimate that the Army occupied about 750 places in the U.S. South. And that at any one time in the fall, they might be holding 400 or slightly more than 400. That staggered people at the time. William Sherman, who had been famously an infamously hard hand of war man during the battles, At the end of the battlefield fighting, he says, we're going to be forced to learn the lesson that Rome and Napoleon have taught the world. And that lesson is you can't change a countryside. You can hold a capital city, and you can tell the people in the capital city that if they don't obey you, you can make their life hard. And they will give you money, taxes, and if you have called their men out for war, they'll send you war. But he said no society had ever been able to remake its countryside. And a very daunting proposition. He said, if you do that, you get what happened to Napoleon in Spain. You get what happened, when Rome overstretched.
And to 2 or 3 czars after the liberation of the serfs.
Right. And so he said, it can't be done. But yet this is exactly what the United States did. And it shocked Sherman. And he writes these furious letters to people saying, don't they understand this has never happened? This can't work. But they did understand the dilemmas, I think. But they also understood that there was no point trying to end slavery from Charleston or Nashville. I mean, American slavery was a rural agricultural slavery. And if you were going to end slavery, and especially if you were going to, as Slaves Teach Army over 1865, to try and create some notion of what they eventually call a practical freedom, you had to be there. And you had to be there not so that the Army could, as sometimes paternalistic scholars said long ago, to teach slaves about freedom. Slaves knew, but you had to be there, as Booker T. Washington and other people said, to teach the masters. That there was a force that was going to be willing to come back at them if they violated it. And that meant you had to be able to get there.
And that force comes in the form of terror, vigilante violence. We associate this always with the Ku Klux Klan, but the Klan was only one such organization. And your occupation, and this is where Greg's sources, frankly, are so rich and surprising. A lot of us, I think, had worked with the papers of politicians before. Thaddeus Stevens, for example, who's a radical Republican, gets lots of letters from Freedmen's Bureau agents and military officers, and so do other politicians. But you also, that amazing Army and Navy Journal, which to me was a revelation. I didn't even know about that.
Published from here.
What's that?
Published from, not from this room, but from New York City.
Well, yeah,
New York
I
City.
mean, but
and one of the editors, the guy who writes the Yes, Virginia later, the Yes, Virginia, There is a Santa Claus editorial.
Who
So the
knew?
Church Family, this New York
full of
publisher.
those, who knew? But the news from on the ground in the South is, this is a gigantic powder keg. It's exploding in our faces. We don't have enough troops. We have troops, but we don't have enough. How are we going to control this? Which only then fuels the politics of occupation, right? In '66. And now it's fueled also by Andrew Johnson, right? Explain that a little bit, because that's a big turning point in your story. When the terror and violence the chaos breaks out in the South. There's already an occupation, but it's as though there's a realization that, oh my God, we didn't leave enough troops.
Right.
We didn't do this big enough. And what do we do now?
We did this thing so big that Sherman thought it was unprecedented in world history,
Right. But
and
it's
yet nowhere
totally
near as big
inadequate.
and yet totally inadequate.
Because
Right.
the white South is rising up.
So one of the things I think a key point to make is that last one. There had been long a sense that the violence comes as a result of of extending the vote to freed people, and that the violence comes then later, or the Klan, which we think of as later. And there's a lot invested in that idea. I mean, because it holds open the idea there was a kind of a golden moment, right? When, as people said at the time, including Chief Justice Salmon Chase, that if right now the white South will take whatever we ask them. And then we kind of have this moment, this what-if moment, which is very important in any revolutionary moment. If they just did that a little differently, we would live in utopia. We'll get to the problem of tragedy and why that's not a useful way to see the world, but it's not a useful way to see the post-war period. Because as scholars, many scholars, from John Hope Franklin to Thavolia Glempt to Steve Hahn to Julie Saville in her fine book on South Carolina, have said this myth that Confederates returned home from fighting and put down the arms of war.
They were just willing to acquiesce.
That's not true. It's true that, that they rarely put on their uniforms and attacked U.S. soldiers. In part, that's because U.S. soldiers arrested them if they put on their uniform, and they had to arrest a fair number at first to send the signal this wasn't okay. But they attacked from the beginning U.S. soldiers, both active and decommissioned, and then thousands and thousands of freed people. And there's very quickly this sense, as people write, that as one says, it's fruitless to talk of this as a state of peace. We're in the very vortex of war. That there's murder, eventually assassinations of congressmen, and an incredibly violent period. And so the army in these outposts is exercising this very narrow function, which is when they write, they say, what can I do? I can regulate where I can see, right around my post. But beyond that, it's a war zone. And so you get these pockets of order, where if you can go, you might be able to get somebody to go with you and force them to accept their order. But you can't get them to stay, right? And then you've got to figure out how to live with it. So these pockets of anarchy, these pockets of order. And as news of this gets up to the north in 1866, it creates this political division, which is very well known. That many Republicans, many of whom had assumed at Appomattox that they were very close, start to say, if we let go of these war powers, we're stuck. This is the best things we'll ever get, and they're probably going to get much, much worse. And Andrew Johnson, who surprisingly in the immediate aftermath of the surrender had very much supported war powers, though using a different language, becomes convinced, not out of love, I don't think, for the rebel South, who he's very frustrated by, but out of a belief that the very 21st century belief in some ways that the president holds the war powers. And many Republicans in Congress believe Congress did. And they fall, and a very powerful antipathy toward black suffrage by Johnson that ties into it. They fall into this brutal, almost bloody, 2-year struggle over who's going to control the war powers, the president or Congress. Still a fraught question.
Give us a little more sense of the scale of this violence in the South. I mean, for example, what happens in South Carolina, which is only one example. I mean, I forget how many now. Several, well, actually 10 or 12 counties are literally ruled by the Klan.
Absolutely.
This is by 70, 71. Terrible violence breaks out, especially in election years, 1868. I mean, this is sometimes hard to convey to students. That, if one person were shot and murdered at a voting poll today out of political violence, CNN's helicopter would be there. We'd all be discussing it. It would be a huge event. Someone was murdered at a voting poll. But hundreds of people were murdered at voting polls, on the way to voting polls, in sheer political murder, and hence this there's great reticence, as you say, in the federal, even among Republicans. They don't want to send more troops into the South. They don't want to have to face this again and again. Grant comes, when Grant finally acts after he's elected in '60, he doesn't want to have to do this. But he does. He mobilizes, I forget, 1,000 troops or so.
Right.
Just to send to those counties of South Carolina to go after the Klan.
7th Cavalry, which will later meet its fate at the Little Bighorn.
Wartime now has to do with this kind of, the kind of violence that actually Grant and Lee too wanted to prevent. They wanted to prevent this kind of vigilante guerrilla warfare coming out of the armies after the war, but it turns out it came out of the society. And hence, power is mobilized to stop the Klan. At least in most places it is stopped, right? For a temporary period.
So it's very hard to get a grip on how violent it was. As you know, I'll do a macro and then a micro description. On the big level, Robert Smalls, an incredible figure, had been a slave during the war, had a pilots a boat, steals it from Charleston Harbor, turns it over to the United States government, gets a bounty for it, uses it to go back to Beaufort, buys his master's house, keeps his master in the house, his master's lost his money in the war, serves in 2 constitutional conventions, 5 terms in Congress, an incredible life. As he leaves Congress, Smalls starts to try and make this estimate, to try and capture how much violence, something Sheridan had tried to do for Louisiana and Texas. He ends up estimating 50,000 African Americans are murdered in the 25 years between 1863 and 1888. Now, there's some fluidity, in that number, but it does show that it's not that lynching comes late in the century and there's this discovery of murderous violence, where it's not even just the Klan at election time, but a consistent insurgency that's looking to destroy black political power by attacking often the very people who are at the head of it and their families.
Kentucky had a lot of violence.
Kentucky a tremendous amount.
Wasn't even a Confederate state.
I often joke that Custer's second to last stand is in central Kentucky, where he sent with the Klan to try and put down the Klan in something that's later misportrayed as an effort to put down bootlegging. On a micro level, you get people like in what was then Company Shops, North Carolina, now Burlington. Wyatt Outlaw, very incredibly interesting figure who emerges from the war, probably biracial, and emerges as a leader of a black political movement in these towns around Alamance County. And as the Klan mobilizes, they very strategically decide that he has to go. Right? They're trying to cut off the head of this union movement operating through union leagues, the Republican Party, and they hang him at the near the center of town from a tree to send this message that this is the cost. And we see an incredible flight from places like that to cities, to the west, to Kansas, to Indian Territory, Oklahoma, to Texas, farther west, and a real effort to try and convince people that resistance is futile.
You call the situation, whether you're looking at 1866 or 1870, 71, you call it a state of statelessness. That there's, I guess it's another word for anarchy. I mean, there are new state governments put in place. Republican regimes, Reconstruction regimes are put in place in all of the ex-Confederate states by 1870. But nevertheless, in that countryside especially, although not just in countryside, there's a kind of statelessness. A lack of government.
I think we have to understand this if we're going to understand why things ended up being so disappointing, because I think it's natural as 21st century people to look back and to say, well, they should have passed this law, or if they made that law or that amendment perfectly, as if we got the wording right, the enforcement and the efficacy will kind of take care of itself.
That have just redistributed more land.
Just redistribute more land.
That's the one we
That
love.
is a big one. Or if
That is a big one. We love that one.
Yes.
That's the biggest what if. But go ahead.
But instead we have to ask, well, what would follow? What were the tools that they had? And the tools they had were these governments that were under constant attack. I mean, in Arkansas, the state government's holed up in the state house in 1868 while people are shooting at it from outside. You have coups against state governments that take over and position and drive out Republicans in other
Makes what
states.
Scott Walker did in Wisconsin look like the Mickey Mouse.
Nothing, right? You've got competing governors, competing state legislatures, town governments where there's multiple towns where governments are driven out in these coups that we've sort of, classed as, that unpleasantness. And so that there's no sense that government can make itself felt, right? That in not just Wyatt Outlaw in North Carolina, but in a very nearby county, the state senator who was the head of the Republican Party, during a political meeting of the Democratic Party, is lured into the basement as they're meeting above his head and is strangled to death in order to send a signal about the impossibility of resistance. That's finally what causes the governor to declare martial law and to call out a militia to put it down, for which he becomes the first governor ever impeached and removed in American history, and is barred, in an irony, one of the few adult men in North Carolina who cannot vote is this guy, because he had the nerve to try and keep the Klan from taking over counties in North Carolina.
Which prompts me to ask you a devil's advocate question here. This has gotten so depressing, I can feel it, This is the vision of Reconstruction that says it was chaos, it was incredible violence, it was statelessness, it was anarchy, it was out of control, which of course is what the Dunning School, the so-called Dunning School, the vision of Reconstruction rooted in the kind of lost cause, white supremacist historiography of the turn of the century and well into the 20th century argued that Reconstruction was a time when American ideology and political thinking went to hell in a handbasket. They should have given the South control over themselves much earlier. The Dunning School argued that this Union or Yankee occupation was the problem. So, what about that? I mean, I mean, somebody might accuse you here, or maybe one of your reviewers has, of returning to that from a newly kind of progressive way or point of view. You're saying there was an occupation, and there was one hell of a lot of chaos, but occupations are not all bad. Go ahead.
So just as a background for the audience, William A. Dunning at Columbia University was the head of a major school that wrote about Reconstruction as a tragedy. Essentially, the tragedy was that the white people of the North didn't recognize their true friends were the white people of the South. And so there was this foolish occupation that meant to remake the South. And as people who were committed to the notion, as W.E.B. Du Bois said famously in Black Reconstruction, that African Americans were at least human beings also, right? Which seems something that was never entirely clear, perhaps in Dunning, but not in his students. Meant to overturn that, they tried to tear down what they thought were myths. And many of those myths they tore down were in fact complete myths. But some of them, we were so eager to show that Dunning couldn't have been right about anything, right, that we missed his sense that something major was taking place. I mean, one of the ironies is that the person who finally puts the nail in the Dunning coffin, Eric Foner, there's an interesting irony, one of the greatest of American historians.
Eric here tonight? Well, it's always good to know,
especially before I say something.
We know what we can get away with.
But there's an interesting irony, which is that if you line up the people who really believe Reconstruction is a revolution, you're going to end up with Foner and Du Bois and Steve Hahn, but you're also going to end up with William Dunning. He believed as a revolution, he just was against it.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that
we thought the counter-revolution was absolutely necessary.
Perhaps too bad, I don't think he celebrated, but
maybe unfortunate, but absolutely necessary, including the Klan.
Right. And so what I have tried to, I think that it's natural when we look at an era where we wish more had happened, that we want to kind of have the benefits without wrestling with the costs. And that we live in an era that celebrates, understandably, legal processes and enfranchisement, and those are incredibly admirable goals. But it doesn't quite capture the problem they faced in the 19th century, which is that if you wanted to make a law meaning something, or as people learned from the grassroots all the way up to Washington, D.C., if you wanted to say people should be able to vote, there was no words on paper that were going to make that happen. It would require force. And in that sense, understanding the thing that freed people taught to the Army, who helped teach to senators in Washington, D.C., which was that freedom and force were things that you could not separate. You couldn't say we get freedom with these words on a page. Instead, it was going to require an occupation to achieve it.
And you're pushing up a hill here, aren't you? You're arguing, from good sources, by the way, from evidence, not just out of the top of your head, that a military occupation can be a necessary good thing in a world, where we've lived with some occupations now. They're hard to love, to say the least. Right?
Yes. I mean, I think that
you're asking us to face down this question that the alternatives were such that if we want Reconstruction to have somehow been more of what it could have been, then we needed another couple 100,000 troops placed in the South for a decade.
Yes, I think that I think is unambiguously true. Look, I mean, no one writes free of the context they live in, right? No one gets to stand outside of history, even or maybe even especially historians. And so, I think for me, what's been interesting about the book is the incredible sense of irony that it creates, which is that, like, most people in the profession, I was wary of our, recent wars and skeptical of the capacity of the occupations to be able to do what we expected. So I don't write it in order to say occupations are awesome and we need more of them.
No.
Like we should franchise them like McDonald's. And instead, I think I was very interested as I look back in Reconstruction in what seems to be a kind of developing common sense, both among people but also in the academy, among scholars of occupation, including that occupations are almost impossible, which is a very powerful and obviously in many ways a resonant notion. And it's not, it's within the realm of it's imaginable that that's true. Right? That terrible question that Sherman asked, what makes you think we're going to be the first people to pull this off, is a very daunting question. So I didn't write this to say occupations are good, but I did write it because I was interested in testing the limits of my own ideas, my own confidence in impossibility, and so capturing what it did accomplish. And also I wrote it to try and discover the point of friction, the point of contact where my own resistance to the reliance on force in contemporary times would meet a situation that seemed to test that premises as much as possible. And I guess it taught me the unpleasant, but to their credit, I think lots of 1860s people did face this and wrestle with it and worry about it, that there were moments when you couldn't create a whole new world without having to ask, how much are you willing to pay in money, but also in damage to the legal institutions and also in human lives in order to achieve it?
See, that's one of the things I like about the way you do history, and I mean this, because you are asking the big questions about what is possible for humans to do and what might actually be impossible. And Americans don't like the question of what's impossible. We don't want our history to be about what's impossible. We want our history to be about what we did, what we created, and what we achieved, and what we triumphed over. There's something very Van Woodward-esque about the kinds of questions you ask. I hope that's a compliment. And even Robert Penn Warren-esque about the kinds of questions you ask. Because at the heart of this book is a story about the necessity of armies. Your book's really about the Army. And your sources are so much about the Army. And I read it as about the necessity, love it or hate it, of government. I mean, you argue here that liberty and freedom are only possible within government and not outside of it. That's a statement in the society we live in now that not only has pushback, but the pushback owns the U.S. Congress and the Supreme Court and 36 out of the 50 state legislatures. And I could go on with that, and then I'd get really partisan. But you're making a case of this big war, nothing like a total war, to force people to do things that they didn't have the imagination for, right?
Right.
Beforehand. And they may not even have it yet, but they realize they have to do something, and yet they were also so limited by laissez-faire belief, by federalism, by
Racism.
and all their habits that they developed for generations. But isn't your book ultimately about the place of government?
It's about government. Army is the government that they had access to at the time in the 19th century.
An army is government.
An army at some basic
Like it or
level
not.
that we might not like. I mean, they really learned, I think that a liberation story, which is a very powerful story of the end of slavery, can very easily become a libertarian story in which people become free, their rights and their freedom move with them, they're kind of their consumables, and then government steps in just to disappoint them. And I think that can be just as powerful from scholars writing from the left as from the right. What's interesting about the Civil War is how much it taught people, from freed people on the ground and the soldiers they encountered to people in Washington, it taught them something that many of them didn't want to face and that many of us are sometimes uncomfortable facing, which is that their own freedom. As Charles Sumner says, right, the lesson that we have freedom in Massachusetts because the sheriff carries a mace. If the sheriff doesn't have a mace, the judge's gavel is irrelevant. It's a very painful thing to think about, especially if you live, as Boston generally was, maybe not after a Red Sox victory, but generally a relatively pacific, place. And it exposed them to how much just the functioning of society placed all of them, not just ex-slaves, in need of a capacity to call upon force. And I find that very disturbing, which is why I'm interested in writing about it.
Well, 1,000 times over, we've all learned on some level that, the French Revolution unleashed so many forces and elements that the world is still trying to harness and cope with. But so did the American Civil War into our history that we're still living with and coping with, the issues anyway, the consequences. Could we talk about that a minute or two? And then I want to get you onto the idea of tragedy, and then we can shut up and let the audience in on this. But the issues you deal with, the consequences of this war, and the necessity of this occupation, the uses of government here. I mean, what kinds of resonances do you see of those questions now?
mean, I don't believe that the Civil War
I'm not trying to put any answers in your mind.
endures in the sense of, I do think the war ends. I just think it happens to end in 1871, not in 1865. But I do think that its consequences clearly endure. One of the consequences is how far should government go to defend rights? And as you know, this is in many ways the ultimate question of the 1870s. That it shuts down Congress. When Democrats shut down Congress, refused to pass a budget. There's a year where the Army is paid in scrip and not in money that they're going to be able to redeem at some future time.
They had government shutdowns.
They had government shutdowns, as Heather Cox Richardson has shown so clearly. And it's over this question, which is what can the Army do if reports come in, this thing that we agonize over, that people knew that the world that was coming into existence in the South was not the world, not just the world we wish had happened, but not even the world that the sort of moderate Republicans in 1867 imagined was coming into being. And what's the possibility? And this hamstringing of it, of this power, the Posse Comitatus Act, which will play back in Katrina. And it's also interesting, though, the things that endure, that even after the final seeming kneecapping of the capacity of the federal government to reach into the South, disfranchisement, the vast withdrawal of the vote from freed people as well as many poor whites, and the seeming end growth of segregation and Jim Crow, that there are aspects that live on. Some, the one that we most like to tell is about the Constitution they remade. And from time immemorial, great historians, Kenneth Stamp, one of the greatest among them, though Franklin never quite said this, that Reconstruction couldn't achieve what it wanted, but it put these pieces of the Constitution in that would achieve a later meaning.
All we had to do is go back to it.
That's right, and it was worth it. That 100, the 90 years in between was terrible for the people involved. I don't mean to be flippant. I mean, Stamp understood the pain and the loss of those 90 years. But there's other ways in which it endures. When President Eisenhower, no great lover of civil rights, but when faced with a state government that's going to refuse to obey a federal judge, he asked his lawyers, what can I do? And they reach back to the 1866 Civil Rights Act, a piece that the Republicans, in the face, these sort of last moments, as Democrats are rolling everything back, they rewrite the law and they scatter it so that it'll be hard for them to pull back each piece. And among the justifications they use for him to send the 101st Airborne to Little Rock is the 1866 Civil Rights Act. We would like to think the Supreme Court says an end to segregation and thus it is so. But in fact, even then, or at Oxford, it took the direct application of force, of this use of force. Do you want to talk about tragedy before we let people?
I want you to go
ask?
first, though.
Oh no.
No, I mean.
One thing that David wrote about he wrote the great book on the memory of the Civil War and the way that shapes American life. But then he also wrote a really beautiful book 8 years ago. Who's counting? We're only historians. About the centennial of the Civil War and about the most complex ways that people struggle with its meaning there. And there you put at the center of it the utility of historians of wrestling with something they wrestled with, which was a tragic view of not just history, but really a tragic view of life. Now this has a bad word in Reconstruction because of one particularly crazy person, Claude Bowers, who wrote a book, The Tragic Era, that denounced Reconstruction. Huge bestseller. And a New Deal Democrat. So in one of these weird, and in Indiana,
so was Paul Buck.
Yeah. So so it's a hard word to use in Reconstruction life. But what is it? Why is it that? What is the tragic view of life that you think history can maybe not teach us?
But questions, no. Well, tragedy's not a word Americans like. We particularly don't like to apply it to our history, but sometimes it's worth trying. I mean, these 4 writers I wrote about in American Oracle. Robert Penn Warren, James Baldwin, Edmund Wilson, and even Bruce Catton, the popular narrative historian. That Catton probably used the word more times than the rest of them. He used it like popcorn almost, just threw it around. It's the idea that, human nature and the human condition is fated with some ugly stuff. I mean, there's 1,000 wonderful lines in Robert Penn Warren you can quote, but there's that passage in All the King's Men, where it's Jack Burden trying to convince Ann Stanton what to do. And Jack's finally gotten wisdom. And he says, well, men are not good or bad. They're good and bad. Which is Robert Penn Warren's view of life. and history and events and human nature. And I know, the word tragedy is so freighted, especially when you're dealing with the South. Because even to employ it about the South immediately conjures up the mythology of the Old South, the sense of loss of what was, the tragic destruction of a civilization, and so on and so forth. But the kind of thing you're writing about here, the possibilities and impossibilities of what was attempted here, the rise and failure, the attempt and the failure of this occupation, or the disillusion of this occupation. Sometimes we need the language, I think, of tragedy. And some of our best writers have given it to us, love them or not. Faulkner. There wouldn't be a Faulkner if it weren't for the Civil War. There wouldn't be a Robert Penn Warren if it weren't for the Civil War. I'm not sure there'd be a James Baldwin if it weren't for slavery in the Civil War. But this is the kind of story that other cultures, the Russians and the Germans and others don't love to embrace all the trouble and the difficulty and the evil in their past. But they're not as bothered by having to face it as sometimes we are in the United States. We want our history to somehow be a rising phenomenon. Reconstruction just doesn't fit that. It has a lot of triumph. It has all kinds of benefits, as Du Bois called it. Right? That famous essay he called The Benefits of Reconstruction, which at that point to even say that was radical. But Du Bois would be the first one to argue that without a tragic vision, you're not going to get this period. There's a lot of effort and failure. And sometimes I think we need the language of tragedy. That's all I was trying to point out. But
It's
you
very
employ it at the
alluring.
end of this book.
It's very alluring to imagine the kind of if-only vision of history, right? Which is a very flattering view, right? If they had our wisdom,
Yeah.
then things would have turned out. There were possibilities they just couldn't imagine. And I actually think that when we look at certain moments, at many, not all of the people, obviously, who emerge out of the Civil War, what's extraordinary to me is how many things they attempt to do and how bold they are. And when they face their disappointments, and as they recognize the terrible fact that Reconstruction, though making enormous gains, ending slavery, changing the Constitution, is not turning out the way they do, some of them throw in the towel. But many of them don't. And many of them go to incredible lengths to try and make it so. Some lengths that, I think would make any of us, worry. They talk about why not run the war forever? Well, we live in a moment when we have a heightened and very understandable awareness of why the problem of suspending habeas corpus or running military commissions
They didn't
forever.
have a professional army.
And but they face that because they recognize the extent of the problem. And the truly horrifying or perhaps tragic aspect is that knowing the problem and wanting to address the problem didn't make the problem go away.
No, and of course, we haven't even addressed enough, and we'll stop here, but the greatest limitation of all was about race. The American imagination to free the slaves, the Republican coalition that brings that about during the war is amazing, is remarkable. And Jim Oakes here has written a lot about that. But the imagination, the racial imagination, and this is no apology for them, but the racial imagination that Reconstruction took, one way of approaching it is to say, well, they weren't ready, whatever that means in history. When is anybody ready for what's new and difficult and revolutionary? We're never ready for revolution, I don't think. But the racial imagination of the 19th century was so blunted. It's what frustrated a Frederick Douglass, for example, about Reconstruction. And yet his own economic imagination was frankly rather limited. He didn't know how to redistribute property. He couldn't imagine doing that either. Taking property from these people and giving it to them. He thought they should do some of that, but that was even too radical to him. And it makes us think, I think Reconstruction is that example that constantly makes us think about, so what are the limits of our imagination? What do we have the political will to do? What do we have the imagination to even try within our institutions, such as they are, dysfunctional or not? Oh, it's a negative note to end on. there's a sentence here, and then we'll open it up. There's a simple sentence in Greg's epilogue where he said, everyone who writes on Reconstruction has to face this in their epilogue, And Eric did it beautifully in his epilogue. We all do this. Your sentence is, the tragedy of Reconstruction was not its leaders' imperfections, but the enormity of the obstacles they faced. That's a sense of tragedy. We ought to admit it. Now we want to open it up to you, and there's microphones somewhere.
You can
Here,
just
right over
come
here.
up. There's one on each side.
Yeah, right
And then
over
make
here.
a line and try and keep
Oh,
your
the lines
questions
are forming.
relatively quick so we can keep through them. And then once you ask it, we'll answer and keep it moving.
Hey.
Why don't?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, you want to start? Let's start on a.
Steve,
Thank you for a very stimulating.
all the historians are lining up.
The historians are lining up. So, we learned from Eric Foner, and more specifically his father Jack, that there were 180,000 African Americans in the Union Army. Whether that was the number at the end, certainly the total of 1 million, 1 in 5 Union Army soldiers had a black face. You didn't speak about this in this conversation, but I wonder if one of the what ifs might have been, Lincoln, right before he's assassinated, goes down to Richmond, and there are black troops who help him lead him into town. What happened to the black troops after the war? Why were they not able to sort of play the role of an occupying army, or was that just a bridge too far?
This is a really interesting story, and I'm glad you asked it. There are a widespread utilization of the black troops for two reasons, one of which is practical, which is that the U.S. colored troops tended to not be the ones petitioning to go home. Because they knew what they would be going back to, especially the former slaves, if they were going to Georgia or Alabama in 1865. So it's much easier to keep morale and to convince them of the necessity of post-surrender duty. We have this story based on these complaints that get to Johnson from certain places, especially from Greenville, Tennessee, his home. And then Johnson suggests that they move black troops to the coast. And this sometimes gets repeated as if this became true. But in fact, as I show in the book, it's not true at all. It's his goal. But Grant thwarts it, he writes, and he says, the president prefers this, but the single most important of our commitments is to the freed people. And if you can't protect them and move the black soldiers to the coast, that's up to you and your discretion. And even some relatively conservative soldiers, George Thomas, adamantly says, if you want to give me an infinite number of soldiers, then I can move the black soldiers to the coast. But with what I have, they're the ones I need. And so in a peculiarity, by a certain point, almost half the Army of Occupation is USCT soldiers. So they do play a central role. There is a question of whether they could have played an even bigger role. And there's no question that the posts that they're at are the most dynamic places where you've got churches and schools and Republican and Union League clubs that are meeting right on the base. They become real radicalizing centers.
My question is, how much did Northern fatigue undermine the success of Reconstruction? I mean, I guess the North said, well, slaves have been free, so everything is wonderful.
A lot. I mean, example, after the passage of the 15th Amendment and its ratification, 69 and 70, all over the press you find this idea, okay, it's over. What more politically at least, what more can we do? Let us have done with Reconstruction, E.L. Godkin said in a headline in The Nation magazine. There was this sense that, look, we've changed the Constitution. We've expended all this energy and treasure and life. What more can we do? And then nothing changed Northern attitudes quite like the Depression of 1873.
Well, that's very powerful.
The massive panic that hit in 1873.
I mean, at the risk of disagreeing with my interlocutor,
go ahead.
I might say I give slightly less power to Northern fatigue because it's true, all the things you say. And yet, as they face the problem of the Klan, the next year they pass one of the most dramatic bills
That's
in
true.
American history that allows the
Klan Act.
president to suspend habeas corpus in a time of peace and to send the army down to make arrests. In 1875, even after the legislature elected before the Congress elected before the Depression of 1873, but in their last gasp, one of the houses passes a bill that would allow them to continue to do that in 4 states, and it dies narrowly in the Senate, and it dies in part because of an effort to pass a Civil Rights Act. Even in 78 and 79, even people like Hayes says it is a victor's right to determine the outcome of the war. So I do think that even moderate Republicans have a sense through the 70s, maybe the early 80s, that things have gone awry and they should do something. But the problem, as Civil War generals would say about battles, is they weren't the only ones on the field, and the Democrats started to defeat them. So I put less on the fatigue of the Republicans, though Godkin and the liberals are a different example.
This is great because the debate among historians really is, was the end of Reconstruction the product of a retreat by the North, or was it the product of a defeat enacted by the Southern White Democratic Party against Reconstruction? And the more and more I do this, I'm beginning to side with the defeat argument more than the retreat as well. But still, the Panic of '73 is huge. I mean, it just got everybody thinking about unemployment.
Yeah, I mean, on the issue of occupation, clearly there's a world of difference between the Nazi occupation of Poland and the U.S. military occupation of the South after the Civil War. So just on that point. But it also seems to me there's an analogy in terms of passing a law and being able to make it real between what happened then and the Civil Rights Movement. Brown versus Board of Education says it's no longer permissible to have a separate but equal. The very next day, what's the reality? The people had to make it a reality, and the troops of that fight was in fact the grassroots of the Civil Rights Movement, and Eisenhower never would have pulled in troops if it wasn't for what was going on. So I'm curious as to, do you deal with self-defense groups that were organized among, not just in the military obviously, but among the people? I'm curious as to, all this couldn't have gone down without there being some kind of an organized response on the part of people who just a few years ago were held as slaves.
Now, the most important actors are the people who teach what needs to be done, are the freed people who are coming in and telling those complaints. That's why those sites matter. And certainly there's many, many areas of organized self-defense, and in certain parts of the Black Belt they're incredibly effective. The problem they face in the American South is that a lot of ex-slaves lived in areas where they could not overcome an organized white resistance without some other, intervening force. But in terms of making government effective, I would say I'm not a powerful believer that history can improve the world. But I think if there's one thing we could do, it's to teach people that those nitty-gritty details of enforcement acts and how they're interpreted, that matters a lot, not just the overarching ideological drive.
My question is going to take you about 80 years afield. While you're talking,
May I have it?
While you're
I do
talking
too.
about the difficulties and failures of occupation and Reconstruction, I couldn't help thinking of two of what I believe are probably the most successful occupations and Reconstruction, although the word is never used, of Nazi Germany and Japan. Was there a conscious effort to learn and apply the failures of the Civil War occupation and Reconstruction to post-World War II?
Wow. A place to look would be the work of Ernest May. Ernest May, who used to be the great diplomatic historian at Harvard, wrote more than one book about the uses of historical analogies among policymakers, and particularly foreign policymakers. His book called Thinking in Time has something on this. The way the World War II generation did think, at least, about American Reconstruction. However, of course, the differences are vast. I mean, if the United States had had a Soviet Union on its border, we might have had a much longer occupation of the American South, right? I mean, the Soviet threat had everything to do with the Marshall Plan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and the rebuilding of Germany. And had there been a China vis-a-vis Japan on our border to the north, I mean, this all could have been different. But analogies are fascinating. They work and they break down. But Ernest May, he wrote a book called Thinking in Time, and it is about how policy people use analogies. You might look for
Ernest May. Thank you.
Sir.
Yeah, I just want to first tip my hat to the fact that I have the advantage of being in a Civil War Reconstruction class at City College. So hopefully I've learned a little bit, at least what questions to pose. I don't have a lot of answers, and I've learned that is built into history. Okay, we read Steve Hahn. The most striking thing about the first book we read was that he says that 500,000 slaves self-emancipated in the course of the Civil War. So my first question is, where did they end up? Did most of them go back south? If they had already emancipated themselves, were they in a position to extend that process? Okay. Number two,
We could take the first one
was already
first. and
been asked about
We're running out of time, so make
about
it
the
quick.
question of self-defense. You do write in your introduction that there was armed struggle among the slaves. My question, the second question is just, to what degree did the Union troops support that? I.e., give them arms, give them training, send them out into the countryside to deal with these violent white supremacists. If anyone was going to be a good guerrilla fighter, it would have been the former slaves. They knew the territory. They grew up there. So my question, this is a what if,
Sure.
but I think it's worth thinking about.
I do think the what if about the sort of guns in hands is a very powerful one. I mean, I do think that there were limits, some of which were racist, some of which were a fear of an outright pogrom, some of which people thought they saw on the ground, and at 50,000 it's not clear that it didn't happen anyway. But of people who feared that it would be one thing on the Sea Islands or in the heart of the Mississippi Black Belt, but that if you sent, if you tried to create an open, flagrant armed struggle in the Piedmont, North Carolina, that the whites would win and would, and you'd be looking at a slaughter of mass proportions. So I think one of the things that we can sometimes underestimate is what it meant to emancipate an enormous, one of the largest slave populations in world history, but in an area where they're not a majority. It's a very different, set of problems or, of questions that they're going to face about self-government than in some of the Caribbean
There are
islands.
pivotal events in this story, namely the Memphis and New Orleans riots of 1866, which in part brought about by the presence of black troops in those cities. Of course, the riot ended up being, in both cases, basically massacres of black people and the destruction of their neighborhoods. Most of those slaves called self-emancipated ended up in contraband camps or in the Union Army. 40,000 of them ended up in Washington, D.C. I think we're told we're only going to take one more, unless it's really quick.
I'll make it brief then. There was practically no leadership after Lincoln in the central government. I mean, Johnson was a disaster, and Grant didn't really pick it up. Hypothetically, if Lincoln had lived,
That's usually the first or second
That's right.
question, not the fourth or fifth.
what do you think might have been the difference?
It has the beauty that we can't possibly be wrong.
Can never be refuted.
I have a lot of thoughts about it. I'll try and summarize it more quickly. I think that when you look narrowly at 1865, that we overestimate the differences in that time frame before Congress comes back between Lincoln and Johnson, and it's not clear that in that time frame that they all speak in Lincoln's favor. Johnson operated, the proclamations he issued had been drawn up for Lincoln and at Lincoln's request, and Johnson makes one important change, not to soften it, but to toughen it. Lincoln had offered amnesty to all but high-ranking officials and people who had taken certain oaths. And Johnson, rather than making it easier on the rebels, says, and let's also strike out all the big landowners. So in that first summer, if there was a lost moment, in fact, Johnson is actually harder on the South. And in fact, quite a few Republicans say, this assassination, I mean, it was terrible, but it was a good thing for us. They come to doubt that very quickly
For a while.
by the end of the summer. And perversely, given the way that we understand Johnson accurately, he's the most racist president in American history, which is a high mark to hit given some of the others.
Got some
And
competition.
possibly the most hated president in American history, justly, though perversely loved by a few. And Johnson has an enormous amount to answer for.
Including in John Kennedy's Profiles in Courage. What that's worth.
But in that narrow moment, it's not clear to me that Johnson was as far behind Lincoln as we would like to think.
I only have one answer to that perennial question. If Lincoln lives and writes a memoir, every conversation about Lincoln would begin with that memoir. said of all the other places we have to begin, because he never wrote about himself. If he had lived through a second term, he'd had to write a memoir.
Right. Well, we want to.
Can't refute that, right?
So, alas, our own.
Can we take one more or no?
I think we should. I'm so
Getting,
sorry for the people who've been so patiently waiting.
But Greg's
I
gonna be
promise
out there
that
signing
we'll be
books,
out there,
so
and I'll be glad.
can
We'll
answer
be
all
glad
your
to talk
questions out
with
there.
anybody. So
Thank
thank
you
you
all
all
for
so
coming.
much. You were great. This was awesome. You have time for a drink out?